Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new. Today I'm bringing you my favorite horror books of all time. So I've been on YouTube now for just over a year, and looking through my channel, I've never done a favorites video. I've done recommendations for beginners, certain themes for recommendations, but I've never shared with you what my favorite horror books are. So you can kind of guess what my favorite horror books are from those videos, but I wanted to create this video to have my favorites all in one place. So if you were interested, these are my favorite horror books of all time. The first one I want to talk about is Dracula by Bram Stoker. So this book was such a delight to read, especially following Frankenstein. I really disliked Frankenstein. The writing wasn't for me, and the overall story just didn't hook me. But Dracula was completely different and such a surprise, and I'm totally here for it. It was so intriguing and gothic, and the writing really hooked me into the story. I'm a bit of a sucker for Victorian style gothic horror, so I really loved Dracula. I don't need to tell you too much about what this story is. We all know this story already. We've seen so many film adaptations, TV shows, books that have been inspired by Dracula. It's such a iconic story that I think everyone needs to read, as it is so foundational in this genre. Um, really loved reading it, and it was instantly added to my favorites list. Next up, we have The Haunting of Alejandra by V. Castro. This story is so incredible. It's a beautiful, lyrical, literary fiction that centers around folklore, horror, and the woman experience. And this book really did change the game for me. It was an instant love. As soon as I read this book, I knew that this was going to become an instant favorite because of the incredible writing. How Fi Castro was able to depict the woman experience and the life that this woman goes through. It was so intense and beautifully written and such a masterpiece. So the story follows Alejandra, who is unhappy in her current life. She is a mom and wife, but doesn't feel like she is herself and she is whole. So yeah, there is so much discussion on social issues in this book. There are triggers for unaliving and that side of things. And the exploration of generational trauma was so good. And overall, the book made me very emotional, and I loved every second of reading this, so instantly became a favorite book. Next up, we have The Woman in Black by Susan Hill. This is a stunning, spooky, yet cozy ghost story with such immense gothic vibes, which I'm here for. Like I said, I love the gothic Victorian horror. It just creates a sense of unease that I adore in my books. So, The Woman in Black essentially explores love, loss, and intense grief, and it's beautifully mixed together in this story. I think that the writing was so intense that was what made this book a favourite for me. We follow a lawyer who is dealing with the estate of a recently deceased woman who lives by herself on this isolated house on a causeway. So I think access to this house you can only get at certain points in time. So when the water levels are high, you can't really access it. So when he goes here, he wants to stay in the house, get everything sorted quickly, but by isolating himself at certain points in time on this house island, he starts to experience the ghostly elements and the creepy scenes in this house. So it's an interesting story, definitely a really good ghost story to read, especially as it's gothic in style. I adore this book and really loved my experience reading it. I would love to read this again for the first time because it was so intense and made me feel uneasy whilst I was reading it. But it's definitely worth your time. Next up, we have The Cotton Candy Massacre by Christopher Robinson. So this is another newer book into my favourites list. I adore this one. I read this for my Killer Clown vlog and instantly fell in love. This writing is so unique and stunning that I instantly wanted to read everything that this author's ever written. And I do have like a shrine on my top shelf with all of his books that I've adored. So this book follows these group of kids who go to a recently restored carnival. And we follow their different perspectives in this story, and all hell breaks loose when this carnival kicks off. And yeah, shit hits the fan and we just have chaos. And I love chaos in books. It is so good. And this book really does highlight the craziness. We also have the killer clown aspect, well, were-clowns. And yeah, it's just so crazy and intense that it instantly became one of my favourite reads of all time. Next up, we have The Wasp Factory by Ian Banks. So this is a really dark and unsettling story that just I fell in love with. This book has such a slow build that you kind of have that unease, that unsettled feeling the entire time you're reading this. So it's really twisted and it's an incredible book to read. This book follows Frank as he recounts his murders that he did when he was a child in the lead up to his brother coming home. So he's just telling his life story, and we learn the details about his killings whilst he was growing up. And it's told in that first person perspective. So he's saying, like, I did this, I killed my younger brother Paul. So it's really dark and it explores like the human psyche and delves deep into the mind of a serial killer. So it's definitely like a bit of cruel humor in this, and it had such creepy elements that I really enjoyed. So I really loved reading this book. Up next, we have Dark Matter by Michelle Paver. This is another ghostly based story that I instantly fell in love with because of the setting. So this book takes place in the Arctic, as you can tell by the wintry scene on the cover. We follow Jack, who is really poor, and he joins an expedition team to explore the Arctic for some new life, a new experience. But he ends up getting isolated on this island and he has to survive by himself. And obviously there's like a supernatural element to this ghostly story. We have things like the unseen horror. So there's such a build of tension and suspense, which I really enjoyed. And I think that Michelle did this really well in her writing to be able to kind of portray those feelings in this isolated setting. And you really do feel sorry for Jack, and you really want the best for him in this story. So I really loved reading this. It's definitely one of my favorite ghost stories set in an Arctic. I do have a more recent one which I enjoyed. I'll link my polar horror video as well, because a more recent ghost story set in the Arctic was released by one of my favorite authors. So that is on par with Dark Matter for me, but you'll have to check out that video if you want to see which book that is. But this is definitely one of my favorite books of all time, which is why I'm talking about this one in this video. Next up, we have The Hellbound Heart by Clive Barker. This is one of the craziest, scariest, darkest stories that I've read. I really love this story. This is following Frank, who wants his ultimate pleasures to be granted to him. So he has a puzzle box that summons these ancient demons, the Cenobites, to grant him these pleasures. And we follow it from there. He gets taken by the Cenobites, and then to have the human experience again, he gets his brother's wife to bring him some men in order to kill and form himself as a human once again. So it's really dark and visceral. The descriptions in this book were incredible. I completely felt myself in the story, experiencing all of these creepy, disgusting, and gory things. So it's such a good book to read, especially if you're into the descriptive elements of a book. This has such incredible descriptions, and you completely put yourself in that world. So really love this story. The Hellbound Heart explores human wants and desires, obsessions, and compelling natures of certain people. So it's an incredible story to read, and is one of my favorite books. And also the movie version is one of my favorite horror movies of all time too. So I absolutely adore this book. Next up, we have The Law of the Skies, which is the ultimate darkest story that I have ever read. It's the darkest story of dark stories. The author of this book really didn't hold back on the level of extremeness that he went to in this story. And I'm here for it because it was incredible and I absolutely ate that up. So, The Law of the Skies follows a group of children who go on a field trip into the woods, and it kind of explores the nature versus nurture side of things in terms of these children. One of the children ends up killing off their human chaperones and then also the children as well. So this one child who is like 6 years old is going around killing, and these descriptions of the kills were so grotesque and detailed, which I absolutely adored. This book was so extreme that it didn't hold back, and I absolutely loved that. So overall, it's a really bleak story, but it's so dark and grim that I absolutely adored reading it. It's so, so good, and I would highly suggest reading this book if you're wanting to explore the more extreme side of horror. Next up, we have The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. And wow, this book altered my brain chemistry in a way that makes me think of this book all the damn time. This is such a roller coaster of a journey to read, and it's made Stephen Graham Jones an automatic buy for me. This is definitely a standout and my favourite from Stephen Graham Jones ever. So The Only Good Indians is a story that follows these four friends who decide to kill some elk. 10 years later, they are getting killed off one by one, and they're trying to figure out the reasons why. It's really a story around nature's revenge. Really, these men shouldn't have killed the elk, and they're being hunted for it. I love when books are written around killing humans because they have done the environment or animals wrong. I absolutely adore this book. It had the most grotesque scenes of animal killing that I've read in a book, um, at least at the time that I read it. And I physically had to put this book down because I was so inundated with emotions. I felt like everything that was happening and being described in this book. I was on such a roller coaster that I physically had to stop reading and just take a minute to sit in my feelings and like just sob because of how sad and how upset the killing actually made me. Um, so yeah, it was so emotive. And that's, I think, what pushed this book over the edge for me as being one of my favorite books of all time. It's so visceral. It plays on your heartstrings, and it's like a big fu to people who do wrong, really, and nature getting its revenge. So I adore this book, and it's honestly like one of my comfort books now at this point. I really love reading this. It's such a masterpiece, and I can't think of anything else to say for it other than it's one of the most perfect books I've ever read, and I think everybody needs to read it in their life. And lastly, I don't know if you could tell what my favorite book of all time is, but that is Pet Sematary by Stephen King. So essentially, this is a book that I read whenever I was a teenager and instantly fell in love with it then, reread it when I was an adult, and again, it didn't change. I really love this book. It's so incredibly written. It's like the ultimate scary story, and I return to it all the time. I tell everybody that they need to read this at least once in their life because of how much it changed me and how it's not your typical horror story. Pet Sematary, if you don't know, follows a family who move into a new house, and they have a pet cemetery close to their house, and they experience a loss. Their cat passes, and then it gets buried in this pet cemetery, and their cat comes back to life, but it's not really their cat anymore. The story really follows from there, but essentially it explores themes of intense grief and explores what a person will go to and do for their loved ones in a state of grief. This book isn't a traditionally scary story, but it does have real life horror in this, where we have intense grief, and somebody who's feeling that intense grief will do anything in their power to bring someone back from the dead. And it's like a warning, like you have to be careful what you wish for, because altering something that huge can have a significant impact later on. It's definitely a great book to read. I really loved every second of reading it. Like I said, it's not your typical horror story, but with real life horror mixed in with supernatural elements, this book has really created the ultimate horror story. Um, and yeah, I highly suggest picking it up if you haven't read Pet Sematary before. It's just an incredible masterpiece. And the writing, whilst it is Stephen King, it's not too dense. And I feel like this is definitely one of his best books that's ever been written. Um, and I would probably keep rereading this for the rest of my life. So there we have it. Those are my favourite horror books of all time. I hope you have enjoyed watching. Let me know in the comments what your favourite book of all time is. I would love to have that conversation with you. But until next time, keep your pages turning and embrace the darkness. Bye!